Hello, my name is Elias Lewis, and I want to take some time to thank you for coming today and listening to my story about, I don't want to just say friend. He was a friend of mine, but way deeper than that. I'm going to tell you the story about a man that I got to know for 5.5 years that became a part of me and part of my family. A noble man who was respected by just about everybody I know. Before I get into that story, and by the way, I hope that you'll bear with me if I pause, because it's an emotional story and I'm hoping that I can get through it. I'll start by telling you about why I am out here in Ohio Territory, well, what's now a state, and how we settled and where. It began in the early 1800s. My father, Jedediah Lewis, decided that he would move out here to Ohio Territory, like so many other people were starting to do. You see, in 1795, the Treaty of Greenville opened up the whole southern section of Ohio Territory for settlers to come out. And the land was wonderful, and the land was cheap. Just getting here was part of the problem. But where I lived, back in the river valley, between Massachusetts and Connecticut, the people were poor. They had been farming for years and years, and the land was giving out. Families were big. They couldn't really divide the land any further between their children because there wasn't enough to give around. So we decided, like many other people, that we would give this Ohio Territory a try. Got together some families and started our journey out. And let me tell you, that journey out was difficult. We walked most of the way. There were a few people that would get up on a horse occasionally, but a lot of the horses were packed with our belongings that we could bring. And we had a few small wagons, really cart-like, but getting them through the paths was really an issue. You see, what we followed were Indian paths for the most part, and they were narrow, and they weren't very straight. The Indian paths had actually been made out of animal paths. So you can imagine what it was like. Some of the paths that we were on had been used before and were a little bit wider, that people had widened them some, but we had to widen them in several places, a lot of places for that matter. Sometimes we had to cut brush back, sometimes trees. Thank goodness we had a set of oxen with us, because the oxen would help get people through streams and rivers when they get stuck. They would help the horses and sometimes people. Well, we traveled overland, and at night we would eat. We'd feed the animals, and then we would sit down and eat. And by the way, we only got a few miles a day. We didn't cover a lot of territory in any one day. But we would sit around the campfire at night after we ate, and there were a couple people that brought violins with them. And so they would play the violins, and we would sing. And I was 18 at the time, so my contribution was I would dance, if you can believe that. I would dance jigs. But the people seemed to like it, but don't ask me to do that now. At my age, if I tried to do that, I would probably fall down and break something on myself. And if I tried it in here, I would maybe fall down and break something in here. And by the way, while I think about it, I would like to thank the proprietors here of allowing me to present this in Mr. Meyer's wonderful Stagecoach Inn. In fact, I'm really in his house. This is where the meals were prepared for the people that stayed in the inn, and it is an elegant inn. There is a sketch of it behind me on the mantle, which maybe you can't see now, but it's a marvelous inn, and I thank all of the people that allowed me to come over and tell this story to you here. Well, anyway, we finally arrived at a little community that we called Elmwood, and that is located just west of the town of Worthington. We arrived a couple years after the town of Worthington was set up, and I'll get into that in a few minutes. But from Elmwood, we were just west of Worthington, and further west was the community of Sells, founded by the Sells brothers. And as we know, that has since changed its name. Well, it didn't change, people changed the name to Dublin. And that's another story which I won't go into at this particular time. But there we were, close to Worthington, not too far from Dublin. When I got here, I had to decide, what am I going to do to contribute to this community and to make a living? Well, I looked at needs. One of the needs that people always have, no matter where they are spiritual needs. And so I became a local preacher of the Methodist persuasion. And with that job, it was kind of like a part-time job, really. That job, I would go from one house to another. Each Sunday, we would meet in a different person's house, and we would conduct lessons. We had a couple old Bibles, and we would use those in these lessons. Every once in a while, a circuit rider would come around. We were on one of the circuits, and when he showed up, and it wasn't always on a Sunday, but when he showed up, then people would come from all over, and he would preach, either in a barn or out in the field, and we would have a big meal, and just a lot of frivolity. And the circuit rider would preach sometimes for a real long time. He would stay in one of the houses of one of our people in our church, and then he would move on to the next place on his circuit. But meanwhile, somebody had to conduct weddings, funerals, and just ministering to sometimes people, giving last rites. So that's what I did for the spiritual development. I also noticed that there were more and more people arriving out here. And when the word got back east in New England, where we were from, between Connecticut and Massachusetts, word would come back about this wonderful land out here, and we knew the more people were going to arrive. I said, well, we have to build better structures. These little log cabins and such, they aren't going to last if there's going to be lots of people coming out here and communities are forming. So I learned to become a stonemason and a brick mason. And in doing that, I helped build a number of the community buildings around the Worthington and Sells communities and Elmwood, and some people's houses, their basements. And by the way, if you're ever here at the Myers Inn, look at the structure of the basement. That stonework was really nicely done. But I was on several projects like that, and then just as important were bridges. The wooden bridges didn't last very long. If we had a big flood, they would be gone sometimes, and they were wobbly. And we knew more people were going to come, the highway was going to get bigger, so we built a lot of stone bridges. And that business was pretty good for me. But the biggest business I had was the next one. Lots of people got hurt out here on the frontier. It was very hard work. It was not unusual for a person to break an arm or a leg or an ankle or a wrist. And there weren't very many doctors around. There were a couple that came out to Worthington, but they couldn't cover all of Delaware County and maybe even part of Franklin County. So the people would try to set bones themselves, or have somebody in the family do it, of course. But people just didn't know how to do it, and they weren't set right many times. And they weren't straight. And then to keep them healing, they just strapped a couple sticks around their arm or leg and wrapped it with either leather or cloth. And oftentimes they didn't heal right. They were crooked and painful and took a long time to heal. So I learned to set bones. I practiced and I came actually pretty good at it. And I said, we've got to have a better way of them to heal. So I started carving in bigger pieces of wood and carving splints that would fit up to the arm and fit the arm or leg or whatever part of the body was broken. If I could carve a splint to the general shape and then wrap that, the bones would heal straighter and they would heal faster. And that business really, really grew. People wanted those splints. People came up from what used to be Franklinton, but it now is the city of Columbus. They would come up from Columbus and buy products from those splints from me. So I said, well, I'm going to build a factory. So I built a factory in the factory district of Worthington, which is on the south side of the town, right along the river. And it grew. In fact, it became the most profitable business in that factory district. The splints were so popular, one year I packed a horse full of splints and I traveled back to the river valley between Connecticut and Massachusetts, from which I arrived, and I showed the people the splints and sold them, showed them how to set bones, and I stayed there for 2 years and then returned here to my home. Well, now I'm older and I don't have the energy I used to have. And so I thought, what can I do now? I don't get around as much. Even riding a horse is sometimes painful at my age. So I fashioned some wagons and made an omnibus, a bus that had roof on it and could haul people with horses between Worthington and Columbus, and then from Columbus back to Worthington. Business was picking up, more traffic going back and forth. People were going down to Columbus to buy stuff and coming back. People were from coming Columbus up to buy stuff and going back. And so it ended up a very good business. And I called it the Worthington Columbus Omnibus Company. In fact, I even named one of my boys after the company. His name is Worthington Columbus Lewis. We call him Worthy for short. And that's where I am right now. Well, we were in Elmwood, but why did we settle there? We actually settled there close to the town of Worthington because the founder of Worthington, John Kilburn, had come out a couple years earlier and brought a family of 40 people, or not a family of 40, but 40 families with him. John Kilburn was from our valley, and he was kicked out of his home at age 15. And it was not because his family disliked him. They couldn't afford him. At 15, he could make a living, and they couldn't afford to keep him around anymore. So he went to work for a fellow named Elisha Griswold. And while he was working for Mr. Griswold, he learned the clothing business. He learned to dye clothing and make clothing, and he was very prosperous and became very wealthy. But Mr. Kilburn had a heart of gold. He saw all these old people around and young people that were poor, and he wanted to help them. So he got the idea, why not go to Ohio Territory and set up a new community? He didn't need to do it because he was wealthy himself, but he wanted to, and that is shown because he became an Episcopal minister himself. So he traveled out here to Ohio Territory and made his way to Chillicothe, where he met a Colonel Thomas Worthington. And then they became good friends. Then from Chillicothe, he traveled up the Scioto River, and you might hear it pronounced Sciato. But he traveled up the Scioto River till it met the Big Belly Creek in the eastern part of Franklin County. And we know that creek has changed its name now and is now called Big Walnut Creek. From there he traveled west over towards Franklinton and then traveled north all the way up to the Whetstone Creek, which has changed its name to the Olentangy. When Mr. Kilburn went back home, he told the people about this land north of Franklinton, north of Whetstone Creek. He said it is well watered, has plenty of game, a wonderful place to start. So he started this Scioto Land Company. He got people to put money into it. The people had to scrape and scrape and scrape, but because they had to come up with $500 to join this company, and they could make money from it later on. But he got 40 families to put the money in, then he got $20,000, and then started his journey on out to where he's going to set up a new community. And by the way, one of the people who came was Ezra Griswold, who happened to have some oxen, and they were glad that he had oxen to help them out of their tough areas. And guess who the first person to arrive at where the town of Worthington is going to be? It was Ezra Griswold. And that community was set up. It was a planned community. There was no village or anything there before, and it was all set up there above the creek. And that brings me to my story. In my journeys as a stonemason and setting bones and in preaching, doing weddings, I got over by the Sells community itself, and there I met this most remarkable man, a man who changed my life. His name was Shate Aranya, and he was a Wyandot chief. He was a Wyandot chief who stayed in this area instead of moving with the rest of the Wyandots up to the upper part of the Sandusky River. He stayed down here and became very friendly with the white people. He was very well respected both from the white people and from the Wyandot Nation itself. When we first met, we took to each other right away. He invited me into his wickiup. He fed me. And he would take me out as a visit. I made lots of visits. Anytime I could get over there, I would go. Anytime I was near over there, I would stop in and talk to him. He would take me outside into the woods, show me plants that could be eaten, plants to avoid, different kinds of trees, stories of nature. He showed me how to walk like an Indian. Somehow he could turn his toes in and walk kind of on his toes instead of the heels and not make a sound. I tried it and I just couldn't do it. Never like he did. We talked about, he showed me where the fishing holes were, and they fished similar to the way we fish, except once in a while they would use nets if they needed a large quantity of fish. He showed me where animals would come down to drink and a good place to get meat. We talked about things. We sometimes would sit and talk. We talked about spiritual things. Chate Aranya was a very religious man. He believed in a great spirit, a spirit above all other gods. And we talked about our beliefs. He never once criticized or offered any suggestion on any doctrines that I had on my religion, nor did I his. We had such great respect for each other. We listened to each other with our ears. He talked about other things in life. He told me times he'd gotten in trouble either doing something or saying something his wife didn't like. Got him in trouble. You see, that happens with the Indians as well with the white people. He became like my grandpa to me. Grandpa didn't make it out here. Grandpa stayed back. Chate Aranya became my grandpa to me. And by the way, we did not call him Chate Aranya all the time. We called him Chief Leatherlips. And I'm going to tell you why here shortly. Here he was, I adopted him, basically, in my family. So you can only imagine how I felt and what I thought on that day in 1810 when one of my friends came galloping over and say, "Elias, you've got to come, you've got to come. There's 6 Indians that have come down from Indiana territory and they want to kill Chate Aranya and he's calling for you." Well, I was stunned. I couldn't speak. I got my horse ready and I got over there as quickly as I could, and this scene was taking place, and this picture done by a Mr. Sherman. I have never met this Mr. Sherman, but this scene shows about what was to take place. You see, in the year 1809, a Shawnee chief by the name of Tecumseh started a plan to get all of the Indians on this continent together to form a vast army, so big the white men wouldn't dare go against them. And they would move the white people back out of the territory that they used to live in. But he traveled all west, clear past the Mississippi. And he talked to village after village and chief after chief. He went north, up above the Great Lake, and all the way to the Atlantic, and as far south as Florida territory, trying to get them to bring their braves together in a vast army. He maybe wasn't too far from being successful, but Chate Aranya represented a small problem for him, because back on that Treaty of Greenville in 1795, Chate Aranya and Leatherlips, he had put his mark, he'd signed his name on that treaty, saying that he would not make war on the white people ever again. And he always kept his word. And that's why we called him Leatherlips, because he always kept his word. And he did get a kick out of that when he found out our nickname for him. But he was beloved by all, and especially me. Well, he represented a danger because if he didn't go to war, many of the braves of the Wyandots may not have gone to war either. And so that represented a danger to Tecumseh. Chief Tarhe up north was kind of a similar situation. So they had this, somebody said, we have to get rid of him. And we don't know whether that was Tecumseh himself, or his brother the prophet, or maybe a council. They had to get rid of him, they thought, because he was too dangerous to their mission. So Roundhead, Chief Roundhead, along with 5 other braves, showed up to his village, and they told him what was to take place. But they couldn't just kill him. They had to have a reason in their culture. And their reason was they were going to try him for witchcraft. Can you believe that? I knew him for 5.5 years. We talked religious things. He was not a witch. There was no witchiness about him. He didn't practice it. I'm not even sure he believed in it. So this was going to be a mock trial if they're going to find him guilty. And that's what it's going to end up being. Now, William Sells came out and talked to Roundhead and said, you know, they could have stopped it, by the way. They were out here with guns. There were people from the Sells community that came out with guns. They could have either killed the Indians or run them out. But this was still frontier, and we were very close to Indian territory. And if there was a huge, massive uprising, we were not very well protected. And we did not want a major war like that with the Indians. And so they actually put their guns away and decided to stay out of that part of it. But William Sells did go up to Roundhead and offer him the finest stable horse his brother had. A fine horse worth $150. Didn't do any good. They had the trial. People couldn't understand really the language, but it was announced that he was guilty. It was just a put-up thing. Roundhead had told Chate Aranya about the offer that the Sells brothers made, by the way. And when they were done with the trial, he went up to them and shook their hand and pointed up to the sky as much as to say, your God will take care of you for that, thank you. And then, you know what he did? He didn't run, didn't try to hide, he didn't fight them. He went into his wickiup, had his last meal, which was dried deer meat and water. He put on his finest buckskin and came out. He came up to us and he shook our hands. And then he started walking. And as he walked, he sang this song. I don't know the words or what the words were, but I know what that was. It was his death song. And he walked a ways to where there was a hole in the ground. A tree had blown over. And he knelt and he prayed. Roundhead got down there actually and at least acted like he was praying too. The other Indians, they danced behind him. When he was done praying, he held his head up high. And Roundhead gave a nod. One of the Indians behind him pulled out a brand new tomahawk. It looked like it had just been made for this. And he walked up behind him and he held it high for a couple seconds. And then he notched him in the back of the head. And he fell partway into the hole. But he wasn't quite dead. They didn't want him to die yet. They had to make sure it was a, quote, good kill. So Roundhead got down and looked at him to see if sweat had formed around this part of his face. Because according to them, that meant he was a witch and it was a good kill. We know when the body's under stress, it will sweat. And none of us went up to look anyway. We almost had to take Roundhead's word for it. Roundhead eventually looked up and nodded again. And that Indian hit him 3, 4, 5 more times. And we buried him there. And he's still buried there today. Some of his last words were, "If I have to die, I want my friend, the white man, Elias Lewis, to be with me." And I was. The hardest thing I have ever had to do in my life was to watch this noble man, a man like my grandfather, die because he always kept his word. And I vowed that I would tell this story to as many people who would listen, as long as I was able. Thank you.